Russian warship charged forward, the clang of steel on steel echoing across the East Sea as the ocean surface erupted in red-hot fire. In the thick black smoke, the small Korean flag still fluttered, a defiant challenge in the heart of the storm. That moment ignited a chain of brutal days, transforming the peaceful ocean into a colossal battlefield. We will step into a breathtaking military scenario, from the moment the Korean ship was sunk to the U.S. fleet's entry, launching a punitive strike that dragged the entire region into an unprecedented maelstrom. This isn't just a story of guns, radar, or missiles. It's a question of courage, of resilience, to protect every inch of the homeland sea. And to ensure you don't miss any developments, remember to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to continue recounting the most intense and violent journeys of the military world. Now, let's get into the main event. The East Sea was still as glass. The water was clear blue, the waves lapping gently like breathing. On the deck of the South Korean destroyer ROKS Sejong, the great DDG 991, a few sailors stood, their eyes fixed on the horizon. They were used to the long days of patrol, used to the feeling of only the engine's hum and the sound of waves breaking against the hull. No one thought such a peaceful day would become the turning point for the entire region. From a distance, a small dot materialized on the radar screen. 150 nautical miles. The signal grew stronger. On the bridge, Lieutenant Kim, the radar officer, furrowed his brow. An unknown vessel was approaching at high speed. The order to send identification signals was given immediately. Signal lights flashed against the pale sky, radio waves were sent out, but the only reply was silence. No response. When the signal was 50 nautical miles out, the ship's silhouette became clear. It was a Russian Udaloy-class destroyer, hull number 174. The colossal steel gray vessel cut through the water, its engines roaring like a beast charging forward. Lieutenant Kim reported urgently the distance was closing fast. They were not changing course. All eyes on the Korean deck fixed forward. 30 nautical miles. 20 nautical miles. The Russian ship maintained its speed of 30 knots, showing no sign of slowing. The Korean captain gave the order one more time, send warning signals both light and radio. Still no reply. Tension on the bridge mounted, everyone's heart pounded. No one could believe a warship of that size would so blatantly charge straight at them. The distance closed to 2 nautical miles. Young sailors gripped the railing, sweat beading on their foreheads. A few unconsciously stepped back as they saw the massive steel bow tearing through the waves. The sun reflected off its metal hull, creating a blinding glare. An endless moment passed before the nightmare struck. The sound of impact was deafening like a crack of thunder. Metal ground against metal, a horrific sound that tore through the morning air. The Udaloy's bow slammed directly into the port side of the Sejong the Great. The Korean vessel shuddered violently. Steel buckled with a screech and debris scattered into the sea. A single collision, but it was enough to send the 2,000-plus-ton ship lurching to one side. Seawater flooded the lower compartments. Alarms blared. The chief petty officer yelled, "Seal the valves, maintain balance." But the freezing water continued to pour in relentlessly. In the darkness of the engine room, red emergency lights flashed. Heat and diesel smoke mixed as engineers stumbled, trying to keep the pumps running, their hands shaking from the sudden shock. On deck, several sailors were thrown overboard. Their cries for help were lost in the roar of the sea. Life buoys were thrown as the remaining crew gripped the railings, pulling their comrades back aboard. Their faces were pale, eyes wide in disbelief at what was happening. They had been joking just moments before. Now everything had turned into a nightmare of steel and water. A commercial satellite inadvertently captured the entire event. The images released just hours later showed the Russian destroyer plowing its bow straight into the Korean ship. The mangled steel was clearly visible. The coordinates were confirmed: international waters, nearly 100 nautical miles from the Russian baseline. The world saw the picture and was stunned. The news spread like wildfire. Military forums, social media, and international press exploded with the story. In Seoul, the spokesperson for the South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated briefly, "We demand clarification of the truth and guarantees for the safety of Korean forces in all international waters." Meanwhile, Moscow issued a statement of just a few lines. The Korean ship had violated Russia's sovereign waters, and there were no casualties. No apology, no mention of rescue. That cold reply was like oil on a fire. Just one collision, but the consequences were far beyond imagination. A Korean destroyer was damaged, several sailors were missing, and the entire region began to tremble with the sounds of a looming crisis, and the satellite images spread worldwide. The photo clearly showed the Russian destroyer's bow embedded in the port side of the Korean vessel, the mangled steel, undeniable proof. International news agencies from Washington and Tokyo to Paris ran breaking headlines. Social media erupted with millions of shares. The only question on everyone's lips: who will answer for this deadly collision? In Seoul, the South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a communique demanding a transparent investigation and absolute safety for Korean forces operating in international waters. The spokesperson's voice was firm but concise, reflecting restraint in a tense situation. Meanwhile, Russia sent out a statement of just a few lines accusing the Korean ship of violating its sovereign waters and stressing there were no casualties. Not one word of apology, not one move toward rescue. That coldness was like a match tossed onto the waves of outrage spreading across Asia. In Washington, the White House convened an emergency meeting. The subsequent news broadcast shook the region. The U.S. president affirmed that any aggressive action against South Korea, a strategic partner of the United States, would come at a price. Just a few short sentences, but the world understood America was in the game. The Pentagon immediately ordered the Pacific Fleet to deploy. The USS Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group, anchored in Yokosuka, Japan, was ordered to sail south. Accompanying it were a Ticonderoga-class cruiser and two Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. Alarms blared on deck as thousands of sailors scrambled to their stations. Floodlights lit up the Japanese port in the dead of night, marking the start of a massive maneuver. At the United Nations, delegations demanded an emergency session. The ambassadors of several countries called for restraint, but the image of the rammed ship played over and over on the big screen made the atmosphere in the chamber heavy as lead. International experts assessed that if the US truly intervened militarily, the East Sea was in danger of becoming the biggest flashpoint since the Cold War. At the same time, Japanese and Korean media provided constant updates. Some analysts even made a chilling prediction: if the parties didn't control the situation, a full-scale conflict between the two superpowers would be unavoidable. In the darkness of the distant horizon, the engines of the USS Ronald Reagan Strike Group began to roar. The massive ships cut through the waves, heading south, straight for the East Sea. The world held its breath because everyone knew that once America entered the fray, this crisis would no longer stop at a single collision at sea. The East Sea was no longer a peaceful stretch of water. The vast maritime region quickly transformed into a giant chessboard. On the electronic warfare map, dozens of bright dots moved from two opposing directions. On one side, the USS Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group, escorted by its Ticonderoga-class cruiser and two Arleigh Burke destroyers. On the other, the Russian fleet sortied from Vladivostok, consisting of two Slava-class cruisers, four Udaloy-class destroyers, and at least 6 Staraguchi-class corvettes. According to satellite data, the distance between the two fleets was under 300 nautical miles, with an average speed of 30 knots. At this rate, they could be face-to-face in the international waters near the Uliungdo Islands. Aboard the USS Ronald Reagan, the AN divided by SPY, 1D radar systems were fully activated, scanning every patch of sea to identify targets. A squadron of E-2D Hawkeye early warning aircraft was launched, forming a reconnaissance dome from 3,000,000 feet. Every signal emitted, every blip on the screen was recorded with precision, missing no movement. Russia was not to be outdone. The top-plate radar on the Slava-class cruisers operated continuously along with low-frequency reconnaissance systems from the mainland. Akula-class attack submarines had already left port, silently heading south at 20 knots. Their objective to approach the American formation from beneath the waves, the distance shrank by the hour. The skies over the Dokdo and Uliungdo areas began to fill with signals. Dozens of American MQ-9 reconnaissance drones circled high above, while Russia launched its Orion long-range UAVs. Both sides wove a dense surveillance net, as if every square meter of the sea was under scrutiny. To avoid premature provocation, both fleets maintained a tactical formation. The U.S. deployed in a line abreast the carrier at the center, destroyers and cruisers surrounding it, creating a multi-layered shield. Russia chose an arrowhead formation. The Slava-class cruisers led with the Udaloy-class destroyers, fanning out on both wings, and the Staraguchi-class corvettes, forming a protective circle behind. Both tactics showed meticulous preparation for a direct confrontation. Coastal observation stations continuously recorded heavy communications traffic between ships and aircraft on both sides. Radio frequencies overlapped and encrypted signals flooded the airwaves. Experts noted that a single miscalculated signal could trigger an engagement. In this leaden atmosphere, every sailor understood that each nautical mile wasn't just a distance on the sea, it was the boundary between tension and war. The East Sea was being split in 2x2 colossal steel formations, ready for a showdown, waiting only for one final order. And then the board would explode. The blue surface of the sea south of Uliangdo suddenly shuddered. US radar signals registered Russian fighter formations, leaving the Vladivostok base. Speed over 10 kilometers per hour, numbers 12 Su 30 seconds and 6 Su 57 seconds. Their flight path was straight south, directly toward the Ronald Reagan Strike Group's position. Without waiting, the command tower on the US carrier gave the order to scramble. An F-35C engine screamed as 6 jets launched from the deck. Immediately after 8F divided by A, 18E divided by Fs took off one by one, painting twisting white contrails against the sky. The atmosphere, already stretched taut, now became a constant roar of steel and fire. Altitude 3,000 meters. The two formations closed in. Warning alarms blared inside the cockpits. The American pilots' radar screens were covered in red dots, each one an enemy fighter approaching by the second. Missile range was now less than 30 kilometers. One Su-30 activated its targeting lock. An air-to-air missile shot out, tearing across the sky, leaving a long trail of fire. The American pilot immediately deployed infrared flares. A brilliant white light burst forth, pulling the missile off course. It detonated into a thick cloud of black smoke, an immediate counterattack. An F-35C locked on firing 2 AIM-120 seconds. White streaks cut through the air, streaking straight toward the pair of Su-30 seconds. One managed to bank an escape, but the other wasn't so lucky. The missile found its target. A fireball erupted, and burning metal debris rained down into the sea. The dogfight was officially on. Missile after missile, 20mm cannons thundered. The sky became a tangled net of light, crisscrossed with white and red trails. Explosions echoed as the sound of metal and fire merged with the howl of the wind. An American F divided by A-18 was hit. The right wing caught fire, the airframe vibrating violently. The pilot managed to eject as the fighter spiraled toward the sea, leaving a black smoke trail stretching for miles. In the other direction, an Su-57 spun out of control after being hit. Flames erupted as the twisted steel frame plunged toward the white-capped waves. 5 fighters were downed. The sky had become a battlefield of smoke and flame. The F-35Cs, with their stealth capabilities, continued to push deep into the Russian formation, isolating and picking off enemy flights. Meanwhile, the Su-57 seconds used their supercruise speed to climb high, trying to lock onto targets from above. The radio chatter was frantic. Pilots shouted coordinates, warned of inbound threats, and cried for help. Radar screens flickered enemy signals appearing and vanishing, making the cockpit atmosphere thick with tension. On the sea below, thousands of sailors looked up, watching the dots zip past, hearing the explosions reverberate down to the water. At times, it felt as if the sky itself was collapsing under the torrent of fire. The climax arrived. A flight of Su-30 seconds launched 6 air-to-air missiles, simultaneously creating a curtain of fire that swept across the sky. On the American side, warning systems shrieked. Pilots pushed their aircraft to the limit, banking hard, pulling Gs that strained the airframes. 2 missiles were fooled by flares, but the other 4 kept coming. An F divided by A-18 couldn't escape in time. It was hit directly in the fuel tank. The explosion was brilliant, a column of red fire erupting through the clouds. Both sides took losses. At least 7 fighters fell into the sea, 3 American and 4 Russian. The sea shimmered with oil slicks as black smoke drifted lazily, reflecting the harsh midday sun, creating a scene that was both brutal and haunting. The sky south of Uliangdo had become a wall of smoke and fire. Each missile launched was a faded arrow. Each fighter that fell was a dark star torn from the sky. The opening dogfight proved that when 2 superpowers clash, no airspace is safe. As the smoke trails from the dogfight still stained the sky, the direct assault from the sea began. On the deck of a Russian Slava-class cruiser, launch tubes opened. A P-800 Onyx anti-ship missile shot up, leaving a long white smoke trail like a knife cutting through the air. 16 missiles were launched, all hurtling toward the American strike group. On the American side, alarms wailed. The Arleigh Burke destroyers activated their full Aegis defense systems. On the radar screens, a dense cluster of red dots closed in at nearly 10 kilometers per hour. The order to fire was given instantly. The Mark 41 vertical launch systems opened, and SM-6 air defense missiles roared from their tubes. They flew high before diving, intercepting the incoming targets. A chase of light unfolded just above the waves. Some of the Onyx missiles were intercepted, exploding in midair, creating massive red fireballs. But a few slipped through, skimming the water. One slammed into the starboard side of the Ticonderoga-class cruiser. The explosion rocked the ship like an earthquake. A column of fire shot up and thick black smoke billowed, obscuring the sea. The U.S. retaliated. From deep beneath the sea, a Virginia-class submarine fired 6 Tomahawks. Red streaks shot up, tearing through the low clouds, then raced toward the Russian formation. Immediately after, the Arleigh-Burke destroyers launched a second Tomahawk salvo. The roar of jet engines mixed with the sound of the waves, turning the sea into a stage of fire. The first target hit was a Staragushki-class corvette. The Tomahawk slammed into its stern, creating a horrific explosion. The ship's hull shuddered and buckled. Oil slicked the water, igniting into a giant mirror of fire. The sound of rending metal mixed with the sailors' cries echoing in the smoke-filled air. Farther off, another Tomahawk pierced the deck of an Udaloy-class destroyer, detonating in the main radar bay. Flames shot up, and debris was blasted into the air, raining down on the sea. At least 3 Russian ships had been hit, one of which was burning uncontrollably. The scene was now hell on earth. The sea was no longer blue, but a churning inferno. Burning oil spread in red streaks. White-crested waves mixed with columns of black smoke. The stench of burning steel oil explosives and the salt of the sea choked the air. The sound was chaos. The shriek of missiles, the boom of naval guns, the crunch of metal, the shouts of men over the radio, all merged into a deafening, brutal symphony of death. With every passing second, blood and steel sank into the deep, leaving behind smoke trails that covered the horizon. Both sides suffered heavy losses. 1 U.S. cruiser heavily damaged 3 Russian ships, destroyed hundreds of sailors missing. The once calm East Sea had become a crucible of fire and steel, and this was only the beginning of a long and brutal battle. The entire sky over the southern East Sea was stained red with fire and smoke. Aboard the USS, Ronald Reagan, the alarm sounded, marking the moment the U.S. officially launched Operation Uliungdo Retribution. The order from the Pentagon was swift and simple. Neutralize Russian naval power, secure international shipping lanes, and ensure the safety of our allies. Dozens of F-35Cs launched simultaneously, their folded wings snapping open, gleaming in the harsh sunlight. The roar of their jet engines was deafening as they shot off the deck, leaving white contrails like arrows aimed at the clouds. High above the E-2D Hawkeyes continued to sweep their radar, erecting an electronic wall over the airspace. Beneath the sea, 2 Virginia-class submarines fired their second Tomahawk salvo. 48 cruise missiles flew in formation, tearing through the smoke, heading straight for the Russian bases on Uliungdo. Each missile, heavy and long, flew at supersonic speeds, the fire from their engines blazing like dozens of falling stars in unison. In response, Russia deployed its entire S-400 air defense system from the artificial island. Defensive missiles shot up, creating a dense web in the sky. But the number of Tomahawks was too great. Though many were intercepted, more than 20 got through. A series of explosions rocked the sea. Columns of fire hundreds of feet high erupted. A fuel depot was destroyed. The main radar array was shredded, and the entire base shook. It didn't stop there. The U.S. also brought in its long-range bombers. From Guam, 4B, 1B Lancers took off, carrying over 40 tons of precision-guided bombs. Approaching Uliungdo, they opened their bomb bays. A stream of JDAMs fell, hitting the ground and exploding in a chain reaction. As dusk fell, the entire island chain lit up, like a red smear black smoke billowing to the horizon. On the sea, the Arleigh-Burke destroyers provided fire support. Their 127mm naval guns fired continuously, each salvo streaking across the water, blindingly white. The sound of the explosions echoed off the ship's hulls, like ancient war drums, mixing with the sound of engines and steel to create a tragic symphony. The Russian fleet retaliated fiercely. The Udaloy-class destroyers launched continuous volleys of P-800 Onyx, while their air defense cannons roared. The sky became a tangled web of fire. Every time a Tomahawk exploded, the flash reflected off the oil-slicked sea, making the water glitter red and orange, like thousands of bloody mirrors. At least 5 bases on the island were heavily damaged. 3 Russian warships were ablaze, and the US fleet took damage, 1 destroyer heavily wounded. Casualties numbered in the hundreds, a chilling new record for the speed of destruction. The East Sea was no longer international waters. It was a true battlefield of fire and steel. Smoke rose like a wall, blocking the sun, turning the afternoon into a false night. Explosion followed explosion, flash followed flash, painting an epic, brutal picture. A battle where every missile, every bomb carried the weight of history, deciding the balance of power in the region. Operation Uliangdo Retribution had officially begun. The world understood that the East Sea was no longer a distant body of water, but the epicenter of a total confrontation between 2 superpowers. As cannons and missiles still roared offshore, another battle opened up in silence. No smoke, no fire, but no less dangerous. This was the invisible front of electronic warfare. On the Ronald Reagan's bridge, communications officers suddenly noticed their radar signals fading. The screen, once bright, with red dots now flickered. Targets vanished and reappeared in different locations. Air traffic control reported heavy radio interference. The F-35C pilots had to switch to backup encrypted communications. On the other side, Russia had deployed its long-range jamming systems from Vladivostok. Dozens of massive antennas simultaneously blasted high-power electronic pulses, creating a wave curtain that covered a radius of over 200 nautical miles. US experts called it the invisible ghost, a weapon that made no sound but could blind an entire fleet. Every radar sweep returned distorted, fragmented signals like shattered glass. The US GPS system was also knocked off by several hundred meters, causing some MQ-9 drones to fly off course, forcing them to switch to manual control. In the control room, an EW officer yelled, "The jamming is too strong, we're seeing nothing but digital fog." The US immediately countered with its own AN, divided by SLQ-32 active jammers on the destroyers. Antennas broadcast opposing waves, trying to punch through the enemy's radio screen. From the sea surface to the upper atmosphere, invisible electronic waves crashed into each other, creating a dense, suffocating space, as if the whole area was enveloped in a colorless storm. While the 2 sides battled with radio waves, nuclear submarines maneuvered silently below. But even sonar was affected. The returning pings were distorted, and sailors heard only strange sounds like metal tapping in a deep cave. Some engineers assessed that if the signal deviation continued firing, torpedoes would be like shooting in the dark. From the outside, the sea looked calm, with just a few smoke columns in the distance. But in that invisible space, hundreds of radar systems, satellites, and jammers were fighting. The results of this war weren't recorded in images, but in lost connections in the deadly blank spots on control screens. More than 30% of US communications were partially disrupted. Russia also suffered heavy losses. Many of its coastal radars were fried by the counter-jamming. Both sides were fighting in the dark. Neither could truly see the other, but both knew that one missed beat could send their steel fleets to the bottom. In this invisible space, modern technological warfare revealed its cold face. There was no roar of engines, no light of gunfire, only silent electronic waves powerful enough to change the entire battle. The East Sea was covered by a phantom shroud, silently tightening its grip on every ship afloat on the vast ocean. The sea south of Uliangdo exploded like a colossal volcano. Both sides had played all their cards. Now, with no more hesitation, the American and Russian fleets simultaneously engaged in all-out naval warfare. From the Ronald Reagan, dozens more F-35Cs and F divided by A-18E divided by Fs took off. The roar of their jets shook the sea. On deck, sailors ran along the safety lines, their eyes tense. They knew every time a plane launched, it was a life-or-death challenge. On the Russian side, 2 Slava-class cruisers simultaneously opened fire with their 130mm main guns. Salvos screamed across the water, creating waterspouts dozens of feet high. At the same time, their 30mm CIWS spun, spitting out a chain of bright tracers like artificial lightning. The US answered with Tomahawk fire from both the surface and submarines. Each missile left a white trail as it tore through the sky. One slammed straight into the side of a Staragushki-class corvette, creating a massive explosion. The fire erupted in a red blaze. Sailors on deck leaped into the sea. Their cries for help lost their life vests, flickering in the oil-stained waves. In the sky, the dogfight resumed. F-35Cs clashed head-on with Su-57 seconds, while F divided by A-18 seconds engaged the Su-30 seconds. AIM-120 air-to-air missiles streaked. leaving corkscrew trails exploding right behind the tail of an Su-30. The pilot managed to eject as the airframe twisted and fell. Conversely, an Su-57 tailing an F-35 fired an R-77 missile. The round hit the right wing, turning the American fighter into a mid-air fireball. Beneath the surface, 3 Virginia-class nuclear submarines and 2 Russian Akula-class submarines faced off. Sonar echoed with distorted pings. Torpedoes were launched. An American torpedo struck the tail of an Akula sub, blowing it apart in a towering column of water. But immediately after, a Russian torpedo struck the bow of a Virginia. Even steel hulls 10 inches thick couldn't withstand it. The sub imploded, vanishing instantly. The sounds were no longer distinct. Engine roars, explosions, screeching metal, and crashing waves all merged. The sea surface was torn apart. Columns of smoke and water rose like skyscrapers, then collapsed. The scene was a chaotic storm of fire and water locked in a death grip. In the Reagan's command center, screens flashed. An officer reported losing contact with 3 aircraft and 1 heavily damaged destroyer. The commander's voice was sharp. Continue the counter-assault. Do not let them control this area. On the other side, the Russian commander also yelled over the loudspeakers, maintain the arrowhead, not 1 step back. The casualty figures were staggering. 11 warships from both sides, destroyed or partially sunk, over 20 aircraft shot down. Oil slicks stretched for miles, burning in a sea of red. In the water, hundreds of sailors fought the waves, their life vests flickering in the smoke. American sailors on the Arleigh Burke fought fires while shouting for more ammo. 1 wounded sailor clung to the gun, mount his blood mixing with the salt water. On the other side, Russian sailors yelled as fire broke out in the ammunition hold, but they still charged in to seal the steel doors, preventing the explosion from spreading. These moments of life and death turned the naval battle from a clash of machines into a test of human will. The sky turned a deep orange red, reflecting the smoke and fire on the sea. From a distance, the entire area looked like a burning scar across the ocean. No one knew how this battle would end, but it had clearly become one of the most ferocious naval battles in modern history. Dusk had not yet fallen, but the East Sea sky was already bright red from the non-stop firepower. The fleets no longer held defensive formations, but charged at each other like 2 steel torrents. Heavy artillery rounds rained down, and columns of fire shot up hundreds of feet. The churning, white-capped waves reflected the red glare, as if the ocean had become a giant mirror of fire. The Ronald Reagan launched another wave of aircraft. In the air, more than 20 Farads 3-5Cs and F, divided by A-18 seconds, fanned out, intercepting the Russian Su 57 seconds and Su 30 seconds. Every target lock, every shriek of a missile was a knife thrust through the air. 6 more fighters fell, leaving bright fireballs in the smoke-filled sky. On the surface, 2 Arleigh Burke destroyers and a Ticonderoga-class cruiser fired dozens of tomahawks simultaneously. Red streaks cut through the sky, racing toward the artificial islands. The entire sky north of Uliungdo lit up like a reverse meteor shower. Meanwhile, the 130mm cannons from the Russian Slava-class cruisers also rained down relentlessly. Many shells landed dangerously close to the American ships, sending up massive waterspouts that obscured the giant steel hulls. Tension peaked as the air defense systems on both sides became overwhelmed. Radar's flickered targets vanished and reappeared, and officers could no longer tell the difference between live rounds and electronic decoys. One U.S. officer exclaimed, "We're fighting in a steel hurricane," and they were. On the sea, steel fire waves and smoke merged into an apocalyptic symphony. At least 8 warships were sunk or abandoned. An Arleigh Burke destroyer was torn in 2 by a Russian torpedo. Its massive hull slowly sank, leaving hundreds of sailors struggling in the Red Sea. On the other side, an Udaloy-class destroyer was blown apart by a tomahawk that hit its magazine. The flash lit the horizon, and black smoke billowed like a volcano. On international radio frequencies, distress calls were constant. Merchant ships outside the area reported seeing a massive wall of fire from over 200 nautical miles away. The UN held an emergency session. Japan raised its national alert level. In Washington, the Pentagon was in an all-night session. But in the midst of the chaos, the battle raged on. Russia launched another volley of Iskander medium-range ballistic missiles aimed at the U.S. strike group's operational area. The Aegis system opened fire, but 3 missiles got through, landing just over 10 nautical miles from the Ronald Reagan. The sea erupted in massive plumes, and the carrier shuddered violently. The U.S. answered immediately. Two B-1B bombers from Guam dropped dozens of guided bombs. Clusters of fire bloomed on the decks of Staragushki-class corvettes and the field supply port that Russia had just hastily erected. In the twilight, smoke and fire billowed, blotting out the horizon. The East Sea was no longer a sea. It had become an apocalyptic battlefield where steel was shattered, oil burned, red waves crashed like funeral drums, and black smoke stretched for hundreds of kilometers. One small mistake could sink another fleet. The world held its breath as the naval battle escalated into a true storm of steel with no end in sight. The East Sea was plunged into darkness. But the light came not from the stars, but from the hundreds of fires burning across the water. Many areas were still glowing red, like a giant forge black smoke clinging to the horizon. An entire fleet had been torn apart, something unprecedented in modern history. The preliminary statistics were chilling. The US had lost at least 4 warships, 22 aircraft, and nearly 800 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. Russia suffered heavier losses. 7 warships sunk, 5 island bases destroyed, nearly 1,000 soldiers lost. The numbers were incomplete, but they were enough to turn the East Sea into a dead zone. In the international news, the most repeated phrase was "the balance has collapsed." This was no longer a limited confrontation. It had escalated to a regional war. Every military action was no longer just tactical, but globally political. Washington faced the question, press on or pull back. Moscow also faced enormous pressure, as images of burning ships and sailors adrift at sea went viral, sparking outrage and fear among its own people. At the UN, delegations met urgently. Russia remained silent, but the faint smile on its spokesperson's face only fueled public suspicion. Japan raised its national defense level. The Philippines and South Korea placed their militaries on highest alert. The East Sea was no longer a regional hotspot. It was the epicenter of the entire international order. The news reports were no longer solemn. They were heavy. They stopped calling it a collision. They called it by its name, regional war. And in that war, every fleet, every city, every person became a cold number on a global statistic sheet. The sea seemed quiet, but it was only the lull after a terrible storm. On the horizon, fires still flared, like red veins bleeding from the ocean. Beneath the waves, dozens of wrecks still smoldered the flames, spreading across oil slicks, reflecting the flickering light like ghostly lanterns. An Arleigh Burke destroyer hit in the engine room shuddered. Seawater poured in. Sailors screamed into their radios trying to activate the emergency pumps, but it was useless. The ship listed hard to port, the sound of groaning metal, like the final moan of a giant beast. It sank completely, a plume of smoke rising from the deck, before vanishing beneath the black waves. On the other side, a Russian Udaloy-class destroyer did not escape. A Tomahawk hit its magazine. The explosion blew the radar tower clean off. On deck, sailors ran in panic. Some jumped into the sea, their life vests flashing in the thick smoke. Others were trapped in the steel compartments as secondary explosions buried them all. The bow snapped off, and the entire ship plunged into the sea, creating a massive waterspout, taking over 200 lives with it. Across the battlefield, the tragedy played out. Hundreds of soldiers were floundering in the water. Some clung to debris, their eyes wild but resolute. Red and yellow rescue lights blinked like lost stars. The waves crashed against the charred hulls, a sound both tragic and haunting. In the sky, explosions still flashed. Every missile hit was a blooming red nova tearing through the smoke. That light shone down on the sea, illuminating the saltwater on the soldiers' faces. To them, every flash was not just ordnance. It was a bell tolling, reminding them that life and death were separated by a single breath. International reporters described the scene as a steel graveyard in the ocean. The final tally, 15 warships sunk, nearly 40 aircraft, shot down over 2,000 soldiers missing or dead. The numbers were shocking, a scar on the region's history. But behind the wrecks and the smoke, a cold truth remained. One small act, one collision had turned into a storm of destruction, pulling superpowers into a vortex of blood and fire. The East Sea that night was not just a witness to sinking ships. It was a mirror, reflecting humanity's arrogance and error. The moment the hulls vanished, the soldiers fell, the lights flared and died. It was all a tragic epic carved on the water's surface, with a final message: no nation is too big to stand above justice, and no power is enduring if it is built only on fire and steel. The sea south of Uliangdo had become a giant black mirror. Oil slicks covered hundreds of square kilometers. Steel wrecks bobbed and sank, embers still glowing in the dark. The sea was quieter, but it was not peace. It was the silence before a historic turning point. While the sea still smoked in New York, the UN Security Council held an emergency all-night session. On the large screens, live satellite images showed it all: every burning ship, every column of smoke. The delegates sat in stunned silence, the air heavy as lead. Some called it the biggest military crisis in Asia since World War II. The preliminary report left the chamber speechless. Over 20 warships from both sides destroyed nearly 50 aircraft, down over 3,000 soldiers, dead, wounded, or missing. These were no longer military statistics. They were a cold warning to the world. Washington stated flatly, the United States will continue to protect freedom of navigation and the safety of its allies. The spokesperson's voice was firm. Moscow retorted, accusing the U.S. of blatant interference and vowing not to back down. The two statements were like two swords pointed at each other, sending a chill through the room. In the command center in Seoul, officials monitored every development. South Korea did not issue a bombastic declaration, only one short sentence repeated: "We demand justice for what happened in international waters." That very sentence caused many nations to voice their support, laying the groundwork for a broad diplomatic front. In Tokyo, the national alert was raised to its highest level. The Philippines convened an emergency security council. Russia remained silent, but experts noted the technical signature of their involvement in the jamming campaign. The world understood after this naval battle, the order in East Asia had been torn apart and would have to be rebuilt with blood, sweat, and backroom deals. Solemn and final, the last words scrolled across the international newsfeed. The East Sea is no longer a regional hotspot. It has become the epicenter of a change in the global order. And as the smoke cleared, what remained was not who won or lost, but a warning. One small mistake is enough to pull the world to the brink. The battle was over, but its echo remained an ultimatum resounding from the deep. Justice comes not from the barrel of a gun, but from the courage to face the truth. We have walked together through a journey of smoke and fire, from the first missiles to the moment the burning flag sank beneath the waves. This was all a simulation, but it shows us an undeniable truth. War always leaves loss. Peace is the most precious thing humanity must protect. The East Sea in this story is not just a battlefield of steel and fire. It is a reflection of pride, ambition, and human suffering. And in the end, what lingers is not who won or lost, but the question, are we sober enough to choose peace before it's too late? If you found this video meaningful, please leave a comment, a like, and subscribe to the channel to join me on future journeys. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to continue telling stories that are dramatic yet full of reflection, just like this one.